The line between neighborly concern and complete lunacy is thin, but in Sunnyside Estates it was practically invisible. I found that out the night I watched Karen, our HOA's self-proclaimed queen of decency, crawl through my goat pen like she was auditioning for some low-budget spy movie. Black yoga pants, garden gloves, a headlamp strapped to her forehead. All she was missing was a Mission Impossible theme song playing in the background. That was the moment I knew without a shadow of a doubt that Karen had finally lost her mind. It hadn't come out of nowhere. The storm had been brewing for a week. First, she filed noise complaints because, in her words, my goats were shattering the spiritual harmony of the community during their 6 a.m. breakfast bleating. Then she suggested I install a soundproof barn, like it was the goats' fault they didn't appreciate sunrise meditation sessions. I laughed. Because honestly, the idea of goats holding rock concerts before dawn was hilarious. Karen didn't laugh. She stormed off, muttering about bylaws, decency, and restoring vibrational balance. I figured it was just another classic HOA tantrum, like the time she tried to ban porch swings for being visually unsettling. I was wrong. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from and if you like fascinating stories like this. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. The night Karen broke bad started like any other. Me, exhausted after a long day hauling feed and repairing storm-damaged fences, ready to collapse into bed. My phone buzzed with a security alert from the barn camera. I almost ignored it, assuming it was just Pickles or Daisy bumping the gate for attention. But when I glanced at the app, coffee nearly shot out my nose. There she was, in all her stealthy glory, tiptoeing through mud puddles like a raccoon in Louboutins, backpack slung across one shoulder, pulling out a crowbar with the confidence of someone who had watched one too many crime documentaries. I sat frozen for a second, torn between calling the sheriff and grabbing popcorn. Curiosity won. I cranked up the live feed, leaned back in my porch chair, and watched the show. Karen crept to the barn door, wrangled the crowbar into the lock, and popped it open with shocking efficiency, striking a triumphant pose like she had just stormed the beaches of Normandy. She slipped inside, flicked on her headlamp, and pulled out her phone to start recording a selfie video. If it weren't so criminal, it would have been comedy gold. She began narrating, pointing dramatically toward a stack of burlap sacks near the goat feed bins. According to her, she had just uncovered stolen HOA fertilizer hidden on private property, never mind that it was fake, clearly planted and labeled with a brand the HOA didn't even use. This wasn't an exposé. It was amateur hour with a side of delusion. Meanwhile, she hadn't noticed the real tenants of the barn. 12 curious goats watching her from the shadows, blinking at the sudden headlamp like paparazzi had invaded their clubhouse. For a moment, it was a standoff. Then Pickles, bless his heart, decided Karen must be delivering snacks. He trotted forward, sniffing excitedly. Karen let out a strangled shriek, tried to push him away, and triggered a stampede. The rest of the goats, seeing Pickles lead the charge, assumed treats were being handed out and mobbed her in seconds. What happened next was pure poetry. Karen's phone flew from her hand, skittering across the hay-strewn floor. She spun in circles, swatting at goats with a feed scoop, her garden gloves flapping like sad little wings. Pickles nibbled at her hoodie drawstrings while Daisy investigated her fancy sneakers. Earl, who had a taste for drama, chomped onto the strap of her backpack and proudly paraded it around like a trophy. I couldn't have written a better script if I'd tried. Laughing quietly, I strolled down to the barn, flashlight in hand, and gently pulled the outer door closed. No locks, no traps, just a simple wooden latch slipped into place. Enough to keep the goats in and Karen, well, entertained. I checked that the ventilation was running fine and the goats had plenty of air, then sauntered back to my porch to enjoy my coffee and the live-streamed chaos. Inside, Karen was losing what little composure she had left. The goats, realizing they had a new chew toy, began climbing hay bales, knocking over feed bins, and stepping on anything that resembled a personal belonging. Karen's purse became a goat fashion accessory, her hair became a snack, and her dignity evaporated faster than water in a desert. Every few minutes, She tried issuing commands, waving her arms and shouting like the goats spoke fluent HOA bylaws. They didn't. Pickles headbutted her lightly in the knee, causing another dramatic shriek that echoed beautifully through the night. It was, without exaggeration, the most satisfying thing I'd seen all year. I texted the sheriff, attached the video link, and leaned back with a fresh cup of coffee. I might have even added a note that said, "No rush, she's not going anywhere." The neighbors caught wind of it almost immediately. Word spread faster than fire in a dry wheat field. Laughing emojis, popcorn gifs, and screenshots started flying through neighborhood group chats. One neighbor asked if it was real. Another said she was bringing a lawn chair to watch live. Nobody felt bad. After years of Karen policing mailbox heights and banning lawn flamingos for being culturally insensitive, this was karma with a side of goat drool. Stuffed at eatingdepression.com. Yet underneath the humor, something serious twisted in my gut. Because this wasn't just petty HOA harassment anymore. Karen had broken into private property, planted fake evidence, and tried to fabricate a crime scene. If I hadn't had cameras, if I hadn't caught her red-hand, it could have been my reputation on the line. My freedom. That's when I knew. This wasn't just funny. It was personal. And Karen had just declared a war she had no idea how badly she was going to lose. The night was just getting started. If there were an Olympic event for suburban insanity, Karen Wilkins would have taken the gold, the silver, and whatever medals she could have stolen on the way out. Watching her inside my barn, flailing in yoga pants and garden gloves, was like witnessing a slow-motion car crash at a petting zoo, equal parts horrifying and hilarious. This wasn't just a woman trying to make a point. This was a full-blown meltdown, the final act of a one-woman HOA dictatorship falling apart under the confused gaze of 12 very unimpressed goats. Karen had spent years cultivating an image of authority, dressing like a budget Martha Stewart and wielding HOA citations like sacred scrolls. But none of that mattered now. Not when Pickles, Earl, Daisy, and the rest of the herd decided she was the newest chew toy in their pen. Her black hoodie was already peppered with tiny holes where goat teeth had tested the fabric quality. Her expensive running shoes had been slimed into oblivion. Her headlamp was dangling from its strap, flickering pitifully as she tried to fend off a relentless barrage of curious snouts. Inside that barn, Karen wasn't the feared HOA president anymore. She was just a sweaty, hay-covered intruder losing a wrestling match against a dozen farm animals who thought they had found the most entertaining new resident since the Salt Lick. I stayed right where I was, on my porch, coffee in hand, savoring every second as my tablet streamed the chaos. I wasn't about to intervene, not until the sheriff showed up. Karen had written her own script tonight. I was just the guy selling popcorn at the door. The goats had worked themselves into a frenzy, fueled by the scattered goat pellets that spilled when Karen knocked over the feed bin during her first panicked pirouette. Pickles, leading the charge as always, bounced between hay bales like a caffeinated acrobat, while Daisy found Karen's discarded purse and began rooting through it with professional enthusiasm. Earl, bless him, had claimed Karen's backpack and was now proudly parading it around the barn like a medieval knight showing off a captured flag. Karen's attempts to reclaim her dignity were both pitiful and magnificent. She tried barking commands like she was still in control, wagging her finger at the goats as if they would understand anything beyond food and play. But yelling at goats is like lecturing rain for getting you wet. They just blinked at her, tails wagging, and pressed in closer, mistaking her flailing arms for some kind of new and exciting snack distribution method. In her desperation, Karen clambered up onto a low hay rack, swatting at the goats with a plastic feed scoop like she was fending off pirates. It didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. The goats thought it was a game, one that involved jumping, headbutting, and enthusiastic chewing. By the time I finished my second cup of coffee, Karen looked less like an upstanding HOA president and more like a disheveled scarecrow who had been thrown out of a tornado. She tried the barn door once, wrenching at it like a soap opera villain trying to escape a burning house. but I had wedged it just enough to require actual thought and patience, two things Karen never packed in her designer handbag. Instead of thinking, she screamed, and the goats, delighted by the noise, joined in with a chorus of bleats that echoed through the night like a barnyard rock concert. By now, the neighbors were starting to catch on. Group texts buzzed. Links to the live camera feed bounced from phone to phone. Some had already pulled up lawn chairs on their porches, beers in hand, watching the greatest local entertainment since that 4th of July when Mr. Whitman accidentally launched fireworks into his own pool. Inside the barn, Karen made one last heroic attempt to regain control, trying to climb down from the hay rack to reach the back exit. It almost worked until Earl, still dragging the backpack trophy, gave her a friendly nudge. Karen lost her balance with all the grace of a collapsing folding chair, tumbling straight into a pile of straw and sawdust. The thud was spectacular. She lay there for a moment, defeated, mumbling something about lawsuits and animal cruelty, as if anyone within a mile radius could be convinced the goats had organized this ambush. One by one, the goats wandered over and began sniffing her pockets, nudging her sides, curious if perhaps the strange, shrieking human had more treats hidden somewhere. I chuckled, leaned back, and checked my phone. The sheriff texted, "On our way. ETA 5 minutes. Sit tight." Perfect. I turned the volume up on the tablet just as Karen, covered in hay, goat slobber, and what suspiciously looked like a puddle of spilled feed water, began composing her next great dramatic monologue, accusing the goats, the barn, the very air of conspiring against her. Even as I read the excerpt, my heart quit. If she had any idea how ridiculous she looked, she never showed it. To Karen, even when chest-deep in barnyard humiliation, she was still the heroine in some twisted suburban opera. But out here, under the wide-open stars, reality wasn't scripted by HOA newsletters or passive-aggressive meeting minutes. It was scripted by mud, goats, and karma. And tonight, karma came with hooves. If you've ever seen a cartoon villain realize they've lost, that was Karen. She stood there in my barn, hay tangled in her hair, one boot missing, arms flailing like a malfunctioning scarecrow. Watching her was like seeing a mix between Cruella de Vil mid-meltdown and a raccoon that wandered into a goat convention and realized way too late. And right as the scene hit peak absurdity, the sheriff's cruiser rolled up my driveway, headlights slicing through the night like the opening credits of a western. Except instead of outlaws and gunmen, it was goats, hay bales, and one very frantic HOA president. Sheriff Davis stepped out, hat tilted back, arms folded with the patient weariness of a man who had seen his fair share of nonsense, but was about to add another legendary chapter. Deputy Arnold trailed behind him, pulling on gloves the way a man does when he knows the cleanup is going to involve more pride than blood. I met them at the gate, tablet in hand, showing the live feed as Karen tried, and failed, to shoo pickles off her now shredded hoodie. "Evening, Sheriff," I said casually. "We got a trespasser, fake evidence planted, and a barn full of witnesses that chew first and ask questions never." Sheriff Davis stared at the footage for a full 10 seconds without speaking, his eyes narrowing just slightly. Deputy Arnold chuckled under his breath. "She looks like a budget supervillain getting mugged by farm animals," he muttered. We walked up slowly, boots crunching gravel, Karen's voice hitting new levels of shrill as we neared the barn. She was now half climbing a hay bale, swinging a broken feed scoop like it was a lightsaber, goats dodging and occasionally headbutting her in casual rebellion. Sheriff Davis knocked once on the barn door, out of politeness, I guess, then unlatched it easily. Karen stumbled forward like a contestant failing a reality show challenge, clutching her backpack as if it contained her last shred of dignity. "Ha ha ha! Haste Soul HOA property!" she shrieked, voice cracking into hysteria. "I have proof! I demand immediate restitution!" The sheriff raised a hand calmly. "Karen, we've seen your proof. We've seen the real footage. You broke in, planted evidence, trespassed, and from the looks of it, you also disturbed the peace of about a dozen very unimpressed goats." Earl snorted in agreement, nudging her aside just enough to send her stumbling sideways again. Karen opened and closed her mouth like a broken puppet, but the words just wouldn't come. Deputy Arnold stepped forward. "Ma'am, you have two choices. Hand over the footage and walk out of here quietly, or we escalate this to resisting arrest." Karen glared at me like I had choreographed the goats personally, but even she knew there was no more fight left. She tore off her headlamp, dropped her bag in defeat, and stomped toward the patrol car, each step shedding hay and goat slobber like confetti after a very weird parade. Outside, she tried to salvage some narrative, ranting about hostile livestock, public danger, neighborhood security. Sheriff Davis listened for exactly 3 seconds before raising a hand again. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "you're lucky we're letting you leave with a ride instead of hauling you in tonight." Karen called Marlene, who screeched up in her SUV, picking her up without a word exchanged. They drove off into the night, two disgraced generals fleeing the battlefield they started. The goats lined the fence as if watching their defeated adversary retreat, tails flicking lazily in the breeze. Sheriff Davis turned to me, shook his head, and said, "You handled that better than most would have." I shrugged, offering a tired smile. I figured if the goats could stay calm, so could I. He chuckled, promised to file the charges first thing in the morning, and drove off. I stood alone under the stars, breathing in the deep, clean air, feeling the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from shouting or fighting. It comes from knowing you stood your ground and let the truth do all the heavy lifting. Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. People like her never are. They don't surrender, they regroup, they rewrite history in their heads until they believe they're the hero. But now she wasn't just fighting a neighbor with a clipboard. She was up against a man who had 12 witnesses ready to chew up her next bad idea and spit it out like stale hay. And the best part? Every single one of them had hoofs. If Karen was a cartoon villain tangled in her own stupidity, the HOA board was her loyal army of sidekicks. Less competent, somehow more desperate. Losing in the barn wasn't the end for them. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Attack by paperwork. 2 days after the goat fiasco, I woke up to find a thick envelope stuffed into my mailbox, practically bursting at the seams with indignation. Inside was a formal complaint from the HOA, citing me for unauthorized livestock gatherings, improper storage of agricultural materials, and my personal favorite, visual disruption, because apparently goats chewing hay in a century-old barn were now considered an eyesore compared to Karen's inflatable seasonal decorations that looked like garage sale leftovers. I didn't panic. I didn't even frown. I poured another coffee, sat on the porch, and read every line with the calm detachment of a man who had already stocked up on trail cams, permits, exemption papers, and a lawyer who knew HOA bylaws better than the people writing them. It didn't take long to realize the play. They were trying to turn the county against me. If they couldn't beat me with HOA fines, they'd bury me under zoning violations and city inspections. It was an old move. Throw enough mud, hope some sticks. What they didn't know was that I'd already reinforced my legal armor months ago when Karen first started sniffing around. My barn was grandfathered in, my livestock registered, my land annexed before their little kingdom even existed. Still, I wasn't taking chances. I called Dave, my lawyer, sent him the full complaint, and by sunset he had drafted a formal response so airtight it could have survived a goat stampede. He filed it directly with the county registrar, attached the original deeds, exemption documents, and photos of my property lines so cleanly mapped they could have been framed and hung in a courthouse. Meanwhile, I made a few additions around the ranch. New no trespassing sign, motion sensors at every gate, another trail cam mounted high in the oak tree overlooking the north fence line where I spotted HOA board members lurking and muttering like a bad Scooby-Doo gang planning their next failed ambush. I also added a special sign right on the barn door. Private property, no trespassing, violators will be greeted by goats. And just to make sure the message was clear, I parked Pickles right by the entrance with a fresh salt lick. Let them try. But they didn't give up easily. The next afternoon, A group of HOA board members gathered just beyond the fence, clipboards in hand, measuring tape stretched out like they were preparing to build a wall they had no right to construct. They were pacing off imaginary boundaries, taking blurry cell phone pictures, and arguing over whether my barn violated some fantasy easement they'd dreamed up overnight. I stayed inside the barn, watching from the shadows, a coffee in one hand, the live trail cam feed playing on my phone. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Every move they made was documented. Every flag they planted on my side of the fence was pulled up and thrown back over like returning a bad serve in a tennis match nobody wanted to play. Later that night, just to put a cherry on top, I dropped off a small bucket full of their plastic survey flags at the HOA drop box with a sticky note that simply read, "Wrong yard, wrong game." And that's when they got desperate. A few days later, Sheriff Davis paid me another visit. He sat on my porch, hat pushed back, arms resting on his knees. "You're not going to believe this," he said, shaking his head with a grin. "They filed 3 separate reports against you. Harassment, property damage, threats of violence." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. "Harassment?" I said. "I haven't even spoken to them." "I know," Davis said, smirking. "That's why we're not acting on it. But heads up. They're planning a community meeting. Big one. Whole neighborhood invited. They're trying to turn public opinion, make you the villain." Actual depression. I sat back, steepling my fingers. Let them try. I didn't need lies. I didn't need speeches. I had security footage, property deeds, and about 50 neighbors who had watched Karen's goat rodeo live and laughed until they cried. The truth wasn't on their side anymore. And deep down, I knew something Karen and the HOA hadn't figured out yet. Once people see you fighting quietly, calmly, with your boots planted and your facts in order, they remember it. And no amount of noise or fake outrage can drown that out. The meeting was coming. The stage was being set. But this time, Karen wasn't the only one writing the script. The day of the big community meeting felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like the opening scene of a courtroom drama where everyone already knew who the guilty party was. The air was thick with a tension that tasted like burnt coffee and cheap perfume, the official sense of HOA politics. I showed up early, carrying nothing but a small folder under one arm. No banners, no speeches, no theatrics. Just the truth, tucked neatly into about 15 pages of time-stamped, certified, legally bulletproof documentation. Inside the clubhouse, folding chairs were crammed wall to wall. Neighbors filled every seat, whispering, shifting, glancing toward the front where Karen stood like a third-rate Disney villain rehearsing her opening number. Marlene flanked her side like a loyal parrot on a crooked pirate's shoulder, clutching her own stack of papers and trying to look important. The board members sat stiffly behind a long table, faces tight, eyes darting nervously toward the growing crowd. Word had spread. Everyone had heard about Karen's goat rodeo debacle. Everyone had seen at least part of the footage. But tonight, Karen was banking on one last desperate strategy. Confuse them, scare them, shame them into forgetting what they'd seen with their own eyes. Marlene opened the meeting with her usual over-caffeinated enthusiasm, reciting platitudes about community values and protecting neighborhood integrity. Then, with the drama of a reality TV host announcing a scandal, she handed the floor to Karen. Karen marched to the podium, shoulders squared, jaw tight, clutching a flash drive in one trembling hand like it was the sword of truth. She launched into a speech, so drenched in fake sincerity I almost admired the commitment. She talked about the dangerous elements invading our peaceful community, the illegal agricultural activities, the unsanitary conditions threatening property values. Every sentence dripped with vague accusations designed to make people uncomfortable without actually proving a single thing. And then came the pièce de résistance. Karen pointed at me with the grand flourish of a stage magician revealing the culprit in a murder mystery dinner. "This individual," she declared, voice trembling with righteous fury, "has violated our trust. He trapped me unlawfully, endangered my safety, and mocked the very principles this neighborhood stands for." A few gasps rippled through the room, but more than one neighbor just folded their arms and leaned back, skeptical. She plugged the flash drive into the projector, ready to unveil her heavily edited version of events. That's when Dave, my lawyer, stood up quietly and raised one hand. "Before we review anything," he said in his calm courtroom voice, "I would like to submit official evidence on behalf of my client. Unedited security footage, 4 angles, continuous recording, no gaps, no cuts, fully authenticated." He handed the board a second flash drive with all the smooth confidence of a man handing over checkmate. There was a brief scramble at the board's table, muttered arguments, a few panicked looks toward Karen, who now looked like a woman realizing her parachute had been packed by her worst enemy. After a tense pause, the board agreed to play both videos. First Karen's, then ours. Karen's footage was a joke. Grainy clips, random shouting, jump cuts so bad it looked like a middle school project filmed on a potato. The room stayed awkwardly silent, the only sound Karen's own voice narrating wild accusations at goats who just stared blankly at the camera. When it ended, there was no applause, no outrage, just confusion, maybe a few snickers. Then they played our footage. Clear, steady, brutal. Karen breaking into the barn, Karen planting fake bags of fertilizer, Karen screaming at goats while trying to film fake crimes, Karen slipping and landing face first in a hay pile as Pickles trotted by with her backpack in his mouth like a prize he had won at a carnival. The room didn't just turn. It flipped. Laughter burst out. People muttered, shook their heads, leaned toward each other, whispering things like, "Unbelievable," and "She brought this on herself." Glenn, an old-timer from the back row, stood up and said loudly, "Looks to me like the only crime was disturbing those poor goats' peace." Karen tried to recover. She leapt to her feet, shouting that the footage was out of context, that she had been entrapped, that this was all an orchestrated smear campaign. But it was too late. Reality had already crushed the fantasy, and everyone had seen it happen with their own eyes. The HOA president, who up until now had barely spoken a word, cleared his throat and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "In light of this evidence, I move for an immediate vote to remove Karen Wilkins from the board and to bar her from holding any future HOA position." The vote wasn't even close. Nearly every hand shot up. Karen sat frozen, mouth working silently, caught somewhere between disbelief and rage. Marlene tried to stand up and protest, but wilted under the collective glare of 50 exhausted, fed-up homeowners. By the time the meeting adjourned, Karen was gone, slipping out the side door, trailed by Marlene, who hissed angry whispers at her like a snake scolding another snake for being too obvious. No one stopped them. No one cared. The spell had broken. Outside, the air was crisp and clean, the stars sharp against the dark velvet sky. I walked home slowly, not with a swagger, not with gloating, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that when the storm came, I hadn't screamed louder or fought dirtier. I had just stood still, and sometimes that's all it takes to win. The days after the meeting felt like waking up after a long, stubborn storm. The sun seemed a little brighter, the coffee tasted a little stronger, even the goats, usually noisy bundles of chaos, lounged lazily in the pasture like they knew peace had finally returned to Sunnyside Estates. Karen disappeared almost overnight. No more drive-bys in her SUV. No more muttered threats at the mailbox. The HOA, battered and embarrassed, shifted leadership quietly, replacing meetings filled with fines and fear with actual community events like barbecues, bake-offs, and gardening days where nobody took notes on how tall your sunflowers grew. Neighbors who had once peered cautiously from behind blinds now stopped by to chat at the fence line. A few dropped off pies and fresh bread with shy smiles, unspoken apologies tucked inside every warm package. The goats, now minor celebrities, greeted everyone like heroes returning from battle. Pickles even got his picture taken for the local paper, wearing a tiny medal around his neck labeled Neighborhood Defender. As for me, I went back to my routines, feeding the goats, mending the fences, checking the cameras less and less as each day passed quietly. No drama, no stage stunts, just life, slow and steady, the way land was meant to be lived on. One afternoon, as I hammered a new private property goats at work sign onto the front gate, a thought settled heavy but satisfying in my mind. I realized this fight hadn't just been about Karen, or the HOA, or even about the barn. It was about something bigger. It was about standing your ground when you're right, even when you're surrounded by noise, by bullies in suits waving rule books like weapons. It was about refusing to stoop to their level, about using truth like a hammer and patience like a shield, about knowing that when the dust settles, people don't remember who shouted the loudest or who threw the most punches. They remember who stood tall, who stayed calm, who let the facts, not the fury, tell the story. I hadn't beaten Karen by screaming louder or being nastier. I had beaten her by letting her own actions collapse under their own weight. I had trusted the truth and the goats to do what needed to be done. And that's a lesson worth carrying, whether you're dealing with an HOA tyrant, a petty boss, or anyone else who thinks power matters more than integrity. You don't have to match their madness. You just have to outlast it. Build your fences strong. Know your rights, keep your cameras rolling, and above all, stay steady, stay stubborn, stay smiling. Because sometimes the best revenge, sometimes it's peace, sometimes it's goats, and sometimes it's just standing quietly while the people who tried to break you trip over their own lies and fall head first into a hay pile. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.